Bible Club, it's Bible Club, it's Bible Club in our town. There's singing, there's laughing, let's get the word on the ground. We're all excited, and we are all delighted. It's Bible Club, Bible Club, Bible Club, Bible Club, Bible Club in our town.
I do.
So, we have been talking about the grace of God, right? The grace of God. And in our verse, there's another word that is a lot like grace. There's a word that is similar to grace. In fact, our verse says that grace is something. What is the word that grace is? In our verse, it says, it is. Cody? Gift. It is the gift of God. Grace is the gift of God. Now, sometimes in our minds, we think that we can work to earn a gift, don't we? We think, oh, I better be good because Santa Claus is watching, right? And if I'm good, then I will get a gift, or something like that. But that's not the way gifts are, especially in the Bible. In the Bible, grace and the gift, grace is given, it's given to people that do not deserve it. Okay? It's given to people that do not deserve it. It's a gift, even though the people who receive it don't deserve it. And we have learned that about Ruth as we've gone through our lessons the last 2 weeks. She was a pagan idol worshiper, and God let her find out about himself. Remember? And then she learned about God. Now, once she had received that gift of knowledge about God, she, through faith, believed on God. She responded to God's grace. But it was still God's grace. And then God provided for her. Remember, she and her mother-in-law came back home to Naomi's home. It wasn't her home. And they were poor. She was a widow. Her mother-in-law was a widow. They didn't have any way to find food. But God in His law, in His grace, had provided a way for widows and fatherless to be able to get food. Does anybody remember how it was that they were able to get food? How were they able to get food? Stephen, do you remember? How?
They got to pick food off the ground.
They picked food off the ground. And God provided for Ruth by directing her to somebody's field in particular. Remember? Do you remember who it was? Boaz. Is that what you were going to say, Aaron? It was Boaz. That's right. And Boaz was a very rich man. And he was an extra kind man. He was a gracious man. Did he have to tell his workers to just drop some food on purpose? No, he didn't. But he did, didn't he? He told his workers to drop food on purpose so that Ruth could get even more food. So, this week, we've learned how God provided salvation for Ruth by letting her find out about Him, and she, in faith, believed on Him. We've learned how God provided for Ruth, provided food and everything. This week, we're going to talk about protection. Now, how many of you know what it means to protect something? You know what it means? How would you say protection? What would you say protection is, Chloe? It's a hard word to describe, isn't it? But you know what it feels like, right? Does anybody protect you guys? Who protects you? Does anybody protect you? Abby, who protects you? Your parents protect you. Your parents protect you. There's a lot of things your parents protect you from. Your parents protect you from danger. They protect you from being hungry. Don't they? How do they protect you from being hungry? They buy food for you, right? They protect you from danger. by locking the doors at night, right? So there's a lot of different protection. And so, but what we're going to learn about in Ruth's life is that that God can protect us. And God has done things to protect us. Now, boys, I hear little bits of whispering. I can talk louder than whispering, but it's distracting to me. It makes it harder for me to tell my lesson. And it's especially harder for the people that you're whispering to hear the lesson. You can, quietly. Let's not whisper during the lesson, especially. So, do your parents protect you from bad people? Yes. One of the ways they protect you from bad people is telling you to stay away from them. Right? Your parents ever say, I don't want you to hang around those people? Parents ever say that? They should, because there's people, godly parents will tell you to stay away from certain people because those people will influence you to do bad. Or they might even hurt you. Now, we are studying the book of Ruth. Which book in the Bible is the book of Ruth? Which one? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. Cody is Mr. Smart Man today. Which one? Ruth is the book of Ruth. Do you know which one it is? The 8th one. Okay, so let's count through, or let's say them through in order, starting with number 1. Ready? Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, Joshua, Judges, Ruth. That's number 8. One more time. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, Joshua, Judges, Ruth. Now the story of Ruth happened during the time of the Judges. And we learned about the Judges last. Remember, anybody remember our verse when we were learning about the Judges? It said, there is a way. Remember, there's a way that seemeth. There's a way that seemeth right unto a man, but the end thereof are the ways of death. And do you remember that verse is 2 times in the Bible? And we said that 2 times in the book of Judges is another verse that says, do you remember that?
I think it was Proverbs.
Our verse was from Proverbs. You're right, Proverbs 14:12. But in Judges, there's another verse that's said 2 times, and it says, and every man did that which was right in his own eyes. Now the Bible teaches us, by those 2 verses, by the Proverbs verse, that if we do what's right in our own eyes, the end is death. The end is trouble. And the world today is full of people that are doing what's right in their own eyes. Even in this room, there's some people doing what they think is right instead of doing what they have been told is what's right. So, this week we're going to learn how God protected Ruth. First off, let's remember how Naomi tried to protect her family. How many remember why Naomi and Elimelech moved away from home? Remember why they moved away from home? What was happening in their land that they moved away from home? Ian? There was no food, which is called a famine. That's right, but no food is the idea. There was no food. And Naomi and Elimelech said, we need to protect our boys from being hungry. So we are going to move away to Moab. Now, God had said that He would protect them, right? God had said that He would provide food for them as long as they obeyed Him. But were the people of Israel obeying God? No. They were in a time of rebellion. And so God was judging them. He was punishing them for doing wrong. And so there was no food. But they thought, we need to protect our boys from being hungry, and so they moved away to Moab. Was that the right thing to do? It wasn't. It wasn't the right thing to do. But we found out that even though it was not the right thing to do, God used it for good. God used it for them to find Ruth, and Ruth turned to him and believed on him, and then she came back with Naomi home. And when she got back home, do you remember last week what Boaz told at the end of our lesson last week? Boaz told Ruth something to do. Do you remember? I remember because I studied it this week. So if you don't remember, that's okay. Aaron, do you remember?
They dropped the
That he told his workers to drop food for Ruth. But do you remember what he told Ruth to do? Ian, do you remember? Come back to his field, right? And do you remember anything else? I might not have said this. He told Ruth, you stay with the ladies that work in my field. And he told the guys to stay away from her. Now when she came home and told Naomi, her mother-in-law, well, I'm just going to call her her mother, because mother-in-law is long to say, okay? But we know it's her mother-in-law. When she told her mom, Naomi, what Boaz had said, Naomi said to Ruth, you make sure that you don't go to any other field. And you make sure that you do like Boaz said, and stay with the ladies that work in his field, and don't be around any of the men in those fields. Now that sounds like a rule, doesn't it? That sounds like somebody telling her what to do. Now Ruth had already been married, so she was not a little girl. You think she might have said, I'll do whatever I want to?
No,
She could have though, couldn't she?
possibly, but I think she would listen.
Yeah, I think she listened. We know she listened because the Bible says that. But how many of us, and we're not even that old yet, how many of us, we get told to do something, and we say, I don't want to do that. I want to do what I want to do. Yeah, we do. We do. Now, was Naomi being mean to Ruth by telling her, only go to this field? She was protecting her, wasn't she? It was the time of the judges, when men did whatever they felt like doing. And that could be dangerous for a young, pretty lady, couldn't it? But Ruth did not say, well, I'm just going to go to whatever field I want. She went back to Boaz's field, and where she was protected. God provided protection for Ruth through her mother-in-law, through Naomi. And God protects us that way too. When we try to do our own thing, what happened to Naomi when she and Elimelech did their own thing and went down to Moab? What happened? Her husband died, right? Her sons died. And in the end, she was very sad. And finally, after a long time, after 10 years, she finally came back home. And she said, God has been dealt bitterly with me. So when we try to do our own thing and protect ourselves and say, I'm smart enough to do what I want, I'll take care of myself. If we're not doing what God says, and we will not be able to take care of ourselves. And God gives us people in our lives that want to protect us. And if we listen to them, godly parents and godly authority do tell you not to do certain things, and they do tell you to do certain things, but it's always for your good. Now, in Israel, God, it was very important, two things were very important to the people of Israel. God had given every family a large amount of land. And it was important to God that that land stayed in that family. And now the way that land would stay in a family was from the father. He would have the land, and then when he died, the land would go to his son. Right? And then that son would have the land, and when he died, the land would go to his son. Right? So it's very important. Two things are important. It's important that the land stays in the family, and in order for that to happen, it's important that families have sons. Now, Naomi and Elimelech, they had land. But, and Naomi had it because she was Elimelech's wife. But did Elimelech have any sons for that land to go to once Naomi died? She didn't. Remember what happened to her sons? They died. They died already. And so now, there's no one for that land is going to belong to somebody else, which is not what God wanted. God set up a system in his law. He provided in his law protection for families' land. And this is what he said. He said that if land, and so what happened, while Naomi and Elimelech were off in Moab, somebody else bought their land. And they were farming it. But the law allowed for a close relative to buy the land back so that it could be in the family and to provide a son for that land to go to. God decided that. He said that it should be that way in his law. He provided a way for that. Now, Naomi had been thinking about this. She doesn't have land. She would have land, but it's been bought by somebody else. And her sons, she doesn't even have sons that can go and buy the land back, which in the Bible is called redeeming it, buying the land back. Her sons are dead, and they can't buy the land back, and she has no way to have any more sons. She's too old. She's too old to get married and have a son herself. So she was thinking about what God wrote in his law, and she told Ruth, this is what the law says that you can do, and I think this is what you should do. The Bible doesn't describe this conversation, but it describes things that show that something like this must have happened. She might have said something like this: Ruth, I notice that you really like Boaz. Every day you come home from working in the field and you talk about how the people are so nice to Boaz and how he is so generous and so kind to all of his workers. And you talk about what a good time you have eating lunch with Boaz. And you know what? Boaz is a close relative of ours. And the Bible has said, God's law has said, that we, as the widow, could ask Boaz to redeem, to buy our land. And he could also marry you. And then you could have sons that would be able to have the land in the future. And so, Ruth told Naomi what she should do. Now, I think this would be kind of scary, because it's not the way we do things here in America. But it would have been normal in Israel. But did Ruth grow up in Israel? No, she was a Moabitess. And so it was probably different for her. And so she listened carefully to what Naomi said. Let's put the phone away. She listened carefully to what Naomi said. And then she went and did it. What was going on? It was the end of the harvest. And all the farms around had taken all their crops to a big threshing floor. It was a big open area where they would separate the useful food from the stuff that was not useful. You know how we have corn? It's a big tall stalk, but we don't eat the whole stalk, do we? We only eat the corn. It was something like that. They would separate the stuff that they would eat from the stuff that wasn't good. And at the end of a big festival, all the farmers, they would use, at the time, they would have all their crops, and not in one big pile. Each farmer would have his grain in a big pile there at the end of a long day of working. And they would eat a big meal, and then all the workers and the women and the children would go home, and the men would stay there, and they slept by their pile of food because it was the time of the judges. And during the time of judges, Israel had enemies, didn't they? One of their enemies would come through when all the work was done and just steal the food, wouldn't they? Remember that from the story of Gideon? Well, so the men would stay there to protect their pile of food. And Naomi told Ruth to watch for the place where Boaz lays down. And when everything is quiet and he is asleep, go and take the blanket off of his feet. Just uncover his feet and lay your head down on his feet. Now that seems strange, doesn't it? But this was 3,000 years ago, and they did things differently back then. This was what their customs told them to do. And so Ruth watched, and when everything was quiet, she noticed where Boaz had laid down, and she went and she laid down, she uncovered his feet, and she laid her head down on his feet. Now that was a special sign. You only did that if you were doing something in particular. And Boaz was sleeping. I don't know. Do you think he was snoring? Some people snore when they sleep. So he was sleeping away, and all of a sudden, in the middle of the night, he woke up. And he thought, somebody is laying by my feet. Is it a robber? Is it somebody trying to hurt me? And he said, who is that? And Ruth woke up, and she was probably scared. She said, it's your servant Ruth. Naomi says that you are a near kinsman, you are a close relative, and that you can buy our property, redeem our property, and marry me. Boaz said, I would love to buy your property and marry you, but there is somebody else who is an even closer relative. If he wants to buy your property, I have to let him buy your property because that's the way our customs are. He's a closer relative. But if he won't buy your property, I will buy your property. I will redeem your property, and I will marry you. And I will take care of this tomorrow. He gave Ruth a whole bunch of grain from that they had finished. Said, take this to Naomi. You have been such a kind daughter to her and taken such good care of her. The whole city knows that you are a virtuous woman, that you're a godly woman. I will take care of this tomorrow. And so Ruth went home and told Naomi everything that had happened. She was excited, but we don't know whether the other close relative is going to want their land or whether Boaz will be able to buy the land and marry Ruth. We're going to find out next week how the story ends. If you want to know ahead of time, you can read Ruth chapter 4. If you want to read the whole story, you can read the whole story in about 15 minutes, just reading the whole book of Ruth, 1, 2, 3, and 4. But this week, we heard, be seated still, we were reminded about how God protected Ruth. And God can protect you. He can protect you in different ways, Aaron. He can protect you by giving you parents and godly authority that tell you to do things and not to do things. He can protect you by giving you His Word, and you read in the Bible things that you should do and should not do, right? But none of that protection comes unless we listen to and do follow the instructions that God has given us. God has graciously, in His grace, told us things that will protect us, but we have to respond to His grace. We have to obey Him in order to receive that protection.